Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the final of the winner's bracket of the Julius Baer Generations Cup, which of course is part of the Chess Champions Tour and being held on chess.com. Now, for the exciting final in the winner's bracket, we have Magnus Carlsen, the five-time world champion, playing against the rising superstar Alireza Firouzja, originally from Iran, now representing France. Now, these two players did face off quite recently in the finals of the Speed Chess Championship in Paris, France. Magnus dominated that match, winning by a score of 23.5 to 7.5. So we're back. Let's see if Alireza can rebound from that and maybe knock Magnus off the perch. All right, so format, same as always. I'll play a 4-game match with 10 minutes plus 2-second increment. And we're going to pick it up in the first game of the match with Alireza having the white pieces against Magnus. So, game starts out with the move e4 here from Alireza, and now Magnus decides to play c6 and the classic Carlsen. Now, this might come as a slight surprise considering that Alireza Firouzja, generally when he doesn't play on e5 on move 1, he almost always plays the Carlsen himself as black. That being said, for Magnus, he's probably trying to be creative. He's trying to play around a little bit, try and feel out some of Alireza's strengths or weaknesses. So we get d4, d5, e5, and now Magnus plays bishop f5. We get to move h4, and here we have this move c5 being played. Now, I do believe that quite recently in a tournament in New York City, none other than Levy Rosman played this move. I forget against who it was, but I do believe he played the c5 move on move number 4, if I am not mistaken. So Magnus obviously trying to play like Levy. We get pawn takes pawn. Now we get knight to c6. And here Alireza plays move bishop b5. Magnus now plays queen c7, and temporarily white is up a pawn here. You have the pawns on e5 and c5. But if you aren't able to consolidate the pawn advantage, black can very quickly target both of these pawns. And if black gets one back, white could be in a lot of trouble. So we get knight f3. Magnus goes to e6. Here we get the move bishop e3, and now we have the move bishop g4 being played. Alireza plays knight bd2, and now we get the move knight to h6. Now, this is all pretty standard from a general standpoint. You could, of course, play knight to e7 as well, but when you put the knight on h6, you're trying to keep this diagonal open for the b. Alireza plays c3, we get knight to f5, and now we have the move bishop to d4. Magnus plays bishop e7, we get queen a4, and now we have the move castles. Now, white is still maintaining the extra pawn in the center of the board. You have this great wooden shield that guards everything here. But that being said, of course, with black having these knights, spying everything, bishop targeting the pawn, bishop on g4 well placed, and white's king a little bit iffy, it's not really that much of an advantage. If you try to castle kingside, it's a bit of an issue with the weak pawn on h4. And if you try to castle queenside, for example, now there might be something like takes, and even b6 here to try to open up the c and potentially the b files as well. So, Alireza decides to take on c6. We get pawn takes bishop, and now we have the move knight h2. Here, Magnus plays the move knight takes bishop. We get queen takes, and now the move bishop f5. White remains up the pawn here, but black now has the two b's versus the two horsies. And additionally, black can try to play f6 and build a black center immediately. Alireza goes g4. We get f6 being played here, and this is a very enterprising sacrifice from Magnus. Now, the computer wants bishop c2, rook c1, bishop e4. Probably Magnus figured after takes, let's just say bishop takes c5 and knight to f3. White is up a pawn here, and even though white is push p on the king side, white can castle, play a bond cloud, and it's hard to really evaluate this as being anything but better for white with the extra material. So, after g4, we get this move f6 from Magnus, trying to open up the center. Pawn takes bishop, f takes e5, and now chaos is breaking out here because Magnus has sacked a b. He's got a big black center, and white's knights are also kind of a little bit misplaced, for the pawns control a lot of central squares, so it's very unclear what's going on. Alireza plays queen e3, and now Magnus plays the move rook takes pawn. Now, it's worth pointing out the computer actually prefers pawn takes pawn here, but frankly, after knight h f3, e4, knight d4, f4, queen e2, let's just say takes loses to knight e6, I should point out, with the classic fork of 3. If you play with like rook f6 here and white goes knight b3, even though black has this big black center with f3 here, white is blockading with these knights. The pawns can't really go forward, even though you have a connect 4, and white should be winning in the long run. So Magnus takes with the rook. We get castles, and now we have the move rook a f8. Magnus trying to utilize the double stack on the file while this bishop spies the pawns on c5 and h4. Alireza goes to f3, and now we get bishop takes h4. And it's surprising to see the computer give white such a big advantage here, considering the material imbalance. Black has all these pawns in the center. You've got the double stack, active b on the diagonal. But computer says after knight to g4, bishop g5, queen e2, rook takes f3, you can very calmly play the move queen takes a5, and white is simply much better. Now, in a rapid / blitz game, is this realistic? I think it's very difficult to play, but it does show how valuable material can be, because looking at this from the human perspective as a top grandmaster, I still feel like black has a lot of counterplay. So Alireza plays rook g1 instead. Very human move here, trying to stop black from playing bishop to g5 and taking the diagonal. Here, we get the move queen to e7 from Magnus, trying to force bishop g5 in while attacking the pawn on c5 at the same time. So we get the move knight g4, bishop g5 is played, queen to e2, and now Magnus takes the pawn on c5. You'll notice here, of course, unlike the other version, white has now lost the pawn on c5. The black queen is a little bit more active here in terms of the threats that it can create. You have d4 to attack on the c5, queen a5 to hit the pawn on c3 and a2, and also the rook on g1 as well. So even though white is still much better and probably winning with perfect play, it's not as simple as it would have been before. So here we get the move king to b1 being played by Alireza, and frankly, this move is simply a huge mistake. Now, in this position, Alireza probably should have played the move knight takes e5, but I will stress once again, this is a very difficult move to play, because when you play this move, you can tell that black is pinning the knight on the diagonal. Black might even have a move like d4, and now you've got the threats on the c file. You have the diagonal as well, and I guess knight d7, queen d5 takes is winning here after bc3. But again, it's very easy to see the boogeyman, and of course, there's this other thing that we know from the great subject of physics called the Magnus effect, where everybody just blunders because your name is Magnus Carlsen. So this would have been correct to take the pawn. I'm not sure what Alireza missed. He probably thought black would take and play d4 like this, but after knight d7 takes king c1, if you take on b2, I just hide the king on b1, I win the rook on f8, and now there are no threats towards the queen. Again, not going to be critical of Alireza, because he probably saw the boogeyman, thought there was some tactic, and he didn't want to go for it. However, when Alireza plays king b1, now after the move bishop f4 is played, white remains better, but black has now almost equalized material. Now black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. White has 1, 2, 3, 4. In fact, black has equalized it. Black now has 3 pawns, a big black center in return for this horse on g4. So Alireza goes knight b3, Magnus plays queen to e7, and now we get the move knight to f2, and Magnus goes c5, trying to push p in the center of the board here and increase the big black center. We got c4 from Alireza, trying to stop black from pushing. Very important, by the way, here that he goes c4, because now the knight will always target the pawn on c5. Whereas if you were to go, like, say, knight d1, now after c4, not only is there no longer a weakness here on c5, but now the pawns are taking even more space in the center of the board. So we got c4. Magnus goes a5 here. Ale. He's going all in to attack. At this point, you've got to do something quickly, because white has an extra horse. The rooks are spying on the king side here towards where your king is placed. So if you don't do something really fast, you are simply going to lose. So we get a5. Alireza plays the move knight takes a5. We get queen a7. And now we have the move knight b3. Magnus goes rook to a8, creating the double stack and threatening the pawn on a2. And Alireza plays a3. Magnus goes queen to b6. And now we get to move king to a2. Now, it's worth pointing out here that Magnus is trying to cheese Alireza a little bit on the clock. Generally, I would say when Alireza gets very low, he is one of the best players with seconds left at finding good moves. So I wouldn't really freak out about the time. But that being said, Magnus is really trying to test and see where Alireza's strength really is. So we got king a2. Magnus plays rook b8. And now we get to move queen to c2, guarding the pawn on c4 and the knight on b3. Magnus now plays move bishop to e3, trying to hit the knight on f2 and distract the queen from the horse that's guarding this other horse. You want to distract. So now we get rook to g2. Magnus plays e4, another move trying to mess up the position completely here, because now there's a lot of pressure on the f file as well. You might take on f3, and it's starting to feel very murky. Now, of course, the computer laughs and says, well, white's just winning. Just play knight to d1, completely winning. It's game over. But instead, we get the move knight to g4. Now, this move is a mistake. The reason being that after knight d1, if black were to play e takes f3 in this position, white can sack the rook with rook takes pawn, takes, and after knight takes e3, now your rook's under attack. If you move it, you lose the pawn on h7, and you're probably getting mated. And if you were to go queen b3, for example, if I trade takes, I don't have to take the rook here. I can instead take this rook with check on the king, and after takes, now white has an extra tower and a passed a pawn that you can just push up the board to win the game very simply. So we get knight g4 instead, and now Magnus correctly takes, and you'll notice that here with the knight on g4 versus being on d1, there's no way to sack the rook with rook takes pawn on g7. Alireza goes rook gh2, and now we get the move d takes c4. Now, at this point, again, Magnus could probably spend a ton of time, but he uses a little over 5 seconds to play this move, and it's very clear his plan is, I want to play on the clock. I want to win on the clock. So we get takes. The computer actually prefers d4 here, because after takes, I guess after rook h7, you can simply go, you can sack the queen and the rook, and then you go f2 and e2, you push p, and you win the game. Instead, we get the move d takes c4, and here Alireza plays move knight a1, and this move simply loses the game on the spot. Now, the best move according to computers to play is move knight to a5. Do I think this is an easy move to play? Not at all, not with 5 seconds on the clock. I do think if Alireza had maybe 30 seconds, he almost certainly would find it. And the reason this move is so devastating is because here, the bishop's under attack, the pawn's under attack, and the c4 pawn is under attack. So you're really trying to fork with these knights every which way here. And if black were to take the horse, now I take the bishop, and now my knight attacks the rook. And if you ever have to move the rook, and I'm able to take this pawn on h7 with check, or take this pawn on c4 with the knight, there's literally no attack towards the king. Let's say you get even this position, for example, just to illustrate it. You'll notice that here, the king is very, very safe. The knight guards both the pawns. King is snug as a bug in a rug, and white will just murder black on the king side. So instead, we get knight a1, which is a big mistake because now Magnus is able to go bishop d4. It's very important that after knight a5, bishop d4, white could take, and now the knight guards the pawn and attacks the queen at the same time. And after queen to a6 and a move like b3 to guard the knight here, now white is going to crash through on the king side, and black should be losing. But after knight a1, bishop d4, now you'll notice A, you can't take on h7. B, there's no knight c4. C, your knight on a1 is simply a dead horse. It's just trapped in this position, doing nothing. And now you're really stuck. So Alireza goes rook c1. Worth pointing out, if he were to play a move like rook takes h7, you simply get checkmated after takes, as the bishop guards the rook and the king has no squares available. So we get rook c1 here. Now Magnus plays f2 here, pushing p, and this move is devastating because it cuts off the coordination of the queen and the rook. Now black is threatening to go queen takes b2, checkmate in uno, and I'm threatening to push p to the back rank, get a queen, and win the game. So Alireza goes rook b1, and now Magnus queens. We get rook takes queen, and then we have the move rook takes rook being played. Now, even though Alireza is able to finally play queen takes h7, after king to f7 here with the rook covering the check on f2, the bishop covering the check on e5 here, white does not have enough checks as the black king starts scurrying towards the queen side. We get queen c2 back, and now Magnus plays king e7. A nice move, just dodging any checks. And here black is simply up a rook for a knight, and on top of being up a rook for a knight, it's a very bum knight on a1, which is just completely out of the game. When you combine that with the threat towards b2 and the domination of the other horse, which can't get back into the game easily due to the wooden shield, white is simply lost. So Alireza goes rook e2. We get the move queen takes pawn being played here. Not the only way to win, but one of the ways to simply mop up the board. You trade down some material here, and now you go rook to f4. And you'll notice that here black has 4 pawns versus the 2 knights, and black has all these wide peoples going up the board, and it's all but hopeless. We get knight to e3, g5, knight g5, a4. Now we get g4, a5. Magnus goes king d7, trying to run his king all the way over. Now we get king c3, we have g3, and now we move knight c2. Now what Alireza is trying to do is connect these horses and gobble as many pawns as he can on the c file, and maybe the e6 pawn as well, although frankly I think it's unrealistic, while Magnus simply is going to go king c6 here and eventually play rook f2 and g2. We get a6, we have king b6, knight to a3, and now Magnus takes, we get knight takes c4, and here we have the move rook to f2. At this point, Alireza is going to have to sacrifice a horse for this g pawn, and with black having 2 pawns on the board here on c5 and e6, it's all but over. The game will conclude shortly. We got knight e5, g2, takes, and in this position, Alireza resigns the game because after king c4, black can simply go rook c2 check, king d3, rook c1. Now you can't go back, and after king d2 and rook h1, black will bring the king back to the center of the board, and with the 2 extra pawns, it's a very clean win. So Magnus gets a huge win in the first game, very choppy game. Alireza kind of fell apart under the time pressure, and it's not looking good. So let's move to the second game. So in the second game of the match, Magnus is now leading 1-0, and he has the white pieces, and the game starts out with the move knight f3. We get c5, and now Magnus plays e4, transposing into the classic Sicilian defense. Alireza goes d6, and now we get the move bishop b5 check, and we have knight d7. Worth pointing out, if Magnus played d4, almost certainly we would have gotten the classic Najdorf Sicilian here from Alireza with the black pieces. So we get check, knight d7, and now Magnus castles. We get a6, and here we have the move bishop e2. Now for Magnus, he's feeling very much at home because he really likes anti-theory, anti-Sicilians, and in this situation, players are going to have to simply play chess. We get knight to f6. Magnus goes d3, we get e6, and now we have the move a4 being played. After a4, we get b6 here. Important to point out, by the way, that the reason that white plays for this a4 move is that white wants to stop black from getting maximum expansion. Let's just to illustrate the point. With the pawn on b5, the pawns take a little bit more space here on the queen side. So when white goes to a4 and we get b6, Now black does not have quite as much space. Now, is it really a big deal? Not so much, but computers generally will say you want to stop black from taking all the space on the queen side when possible. So we get knight f(d2), bishop b7, and now Magnus plays the move knight c3. We get knight to e5, and here we see the reasoning behind moving the knight to d2, which is that white wants to play f4 and grab a little bit more of the center. So we got knight to c6, Magnus plays queen to e1, and now we get the move bishop e7. Magnus plays knight back to f3, we get queen c7, and here we have the move queen g3 being played. Now, Magnus moved this knight away to d2 initially to play f4, but now with these pawns, the knight kind of belongs here as it supports a lot of the pawn thrust. It supports e5, knight g5, maybe even f5 as well down the road. So we get queen g3, g6, Magnus goes bishop d2, and now Alireza plays a very enterprising move h5. Now, what is Alireza doing? What Alireza is trying to do here is he understands that on the queen side, not a lot is happening. White cannot go d4, you would hang a pawn. White cannot go b4, you would also hang a pawn this way. And your pawns on e6 and a6 cover the two jumping squares for the horse on c3. So all this coverage on the queen side, Alireza kind of starts to realize he's going to castle his king to the queen side and start trying to attack on the king side. So we get h5. Magnus plays h3, and now we get the move h4 and the move queen f2. If white were to play knight takes h4 here, black can sack a knight temporarily with knight takes pawn. And after d takes e4, bishop h4, let's just say queen e3 and bishop f6. Black is much better here. You have two jumps for the horse at d4, b4. Bishop can go to d4. And you've got a great scope bishop on b7 to boot. So after h4, Magnus declines the pawn offer. He plays queen to f2. And now we get to move knight to h5. Now Magnus plays rook e1. We get bishop to f6. And here we have the move knight d1. Now Alireza decides finally to castle the king out of the center of the board. He could have also played knight g3 first, but he decides to castle. So we get c3, knight g3, and now Magnus plays knight e3. Worth pointing out that c3 is a very logical move here. First of all, if you were to play knight e3 right away, you would hang the pawn on b2. Secondarily, when you go c3, you cut off the jumps for the horse to b4 and d4 here. But additionally, you might want to play d4 and build this menacing big white center. So we get knight g3, Magnus plays knight e3, now we get d5, and here we have the move e5 being played. Now this move is a mistake from Magnus. Computer actually thinks that after takes knight g4, these knights are really active here, jumping towards the center of the board, and after bishop g7, knight takes h4, white is apparently up a pawn, and if you go bishop e7, now I can play this move b4 with the knight still coming to e5, trying to open up the c and the b files here, and white is apparently much, much better. Instead, Magnus plays the e5, and this move he plays fairly quickly. Again, I think Magnus trying not to get too low on time. We get bishop e7, and now we have the move bishop to d1. Alireza goes king b8, and now we get rook b1. Magnus desperately trying to open up the queen side here with pawn to b4. So after rook b1, Alireza goes c4 here, and this is a move that I really like because now what's happening is if Magnus were to take on c4, after knight to e4, suddenly the queen and the bishop are getting forked, and after queen to e2, now I can go d4, and after takes, suddenly the scope is open for the b. My other b is going to c5 with the two b's and the horse in the middle of the board. Black is actually winning here. Not even just better, but outright winning if this were to happen. So it's a very thematic pawn sacrifice, and Magnus instead plays the move d4. Now we get knight to e4, queen e2, knight g3, queen f2, and Alireza says, no, I'm not going to make a draw here with the move knight a5. Alireza could have played knight e4, and white basically has no squares for the queen to go to. If you go to f1, I go back. You only have these two squares available to avoid losing your queen. So Alireza could have taken the draw here, but as we like to say from the old statement out of the Latin book, Fortis Fortuna Juvat. So fortune favors the bold, and Alireza chooses to be bold here and play knight to a5, realizing that he can always go for knight e4, but knight b3 also exists. So we get bishop c2. Alireza plays knight b3, and now we get to move knight to g5 from Magnus, and here we have rook f8. Now Magnus plays knight h7, we get this repetition, and Magnus decides to play knight f1. Now again, Magnus could have played knight to h7 here and probably forced a draw by repetition, but now Magnus decides not to repeat. So Alireza has a chance, he declines, Magnus has a chance, now Magnus declines, so it's very confusing as to whether their mind games going on or what's happening, but at any rate, both players have decided they don't want to make a draw. So Alireza goes bishop c6 here, a very nice move. The knights are still very well placed for black. You can target the pawn on a4, and because the center of the board is so completely locked here, black should be very slightly better. So Magnus goes bishop e3, we get knight to f5, Magnus takes the knight, we get takes, and now Alireza takes on a4, and we get the move queen to f2. Now at this point, material remains balanced here, but objectively, it should be a little bit easier for black to play, primarily because with this knight on b3 covering the squares and also the files. So for example, say I were to just to illustrate the point. If I could ever go b3 here and open up this file, the rooks can become very active and white is doing well. But in this position, even if I set up a position after bishop d7, you'll notice the knight on b3. There's no way to open up the file. You can't go to a1 either. And black has a much freer hand pushing the pawns on the queen side, just to illustrate the point. Let me just set this up just to illustrate it. If black starts pushing these pawns on the queen side, black's king is very safe because the knight stops all the threats on the queen side. Whereas if white goes g4 and you get some position like this, all of a sudden white's king has much more potential to be attacked when you're pushing the pawns in front of your king than black's king on the queen side. So at this point, black should be quite a bit better after the move a5, both from the general objective evaluation, but also from the practical standpoint because the move should be easier. So Magnus goes knight g3, we got b5, now we have knight to h5, and now b4 is played by Alireza. Alireza more than happy to just keep pushing his p on the queen side here, and Magnus still has not been able to start pushing on the king side. So we got knight to f6, Magnus trying to use D's knights here to create some counterplay. We got bishop b5, and now Magnus plays the move h4. So here Magnus has decided he's going to just push the h-pawn all the way up the board if he can. However, the computer really doesn't like this plan. So we get king b7. Magnus plays h5, we get bishop takes knight, pawn takes, and now we have the move rook to h8, attacking this pawn on h5. Magnus now plays the very enterprising move pawn to g4, trying to really confuse the situation. And as you probably will have noticed, once again, Alireza is way down on the clock. Now, this has to be pointed out that for a second game in a row, Magnus is really trying, in my opinion, to see how good Alireza is when he gets low on time and whether he will crack and fall apart. So Alireza decides to take the pawn, and this is a big mistake actually from a general standpoint. Computer prefers rook to h6, and after g takes f5, there's this move rook to g8, fe6, and after rook f6, even though white is up a pawn in this position here, I guess you have rook g5, by the way, which wins, but let's just say takes even. The pawns are very brittle on f4 and h5 here. The knight is also on a very loose g file, and black has a lot of easy moves to play. So fg4 is actually a bit of a mistake, but Magnus then plays move queen h4, and he plays this move instantly. He does not use any time, whereas the computer here is screaming for this move f5. And the reason it wants this move is because now, if you were to take, suddenly after bishop f4, there are no threats on diagonal, queen guards the bishop, and out of nowhere, you're getting a kebab on the 7th rank with rook e7, and after king a6, knight takes f7. This is a complete disaster. There's a fork of the rooks. You take on f6. Now there's rook to e1 here, and all of a sudden, rook e6 is incoming. Your towers are falling apart. Everything is collapsing for black in this position. So this is the sort of move I would expect Magnus to find, but he spends all of 1 second before playing the move queen h4. And to me, this is a sign that Magnus thinks he's Nepo, actually, in this match, where he's playing a lot of moves very quickly, trying very hard to win on the clock. We get a4 from Alireza. Magnus goes f5 now, but after e takes f5, this is a different scenario. Here, white no longer is bishop to f4. Your queen is on h4 versus f2. So without the move bishop to f4, even if you move the bishop to f2, I can always play something like rook to d7, stopping the kebab, and now black is just completely winning. So at this point, Magnus has totally messed it up, and he's just simply trying to cheese on the clock. We get c takes b4, we get king to a6, and now Magnus goes bishop f2, trying to create the kebab with rook e7. Alireza plays rook d7, we get h6, and now we have the move knight d2 being played. Magnus goes rook to c1, and here we get the move queen to f4. Now this move is a mistake here. Alireza probably should have played the move queen to d6, simply attacking the pawn on f6 here, and white doesn't have a square for the horse, and after, say, king g2, I know the computer likes f4, but even something like knight e4 here feels very, very good for black. After takes and d takes e4, you have these great pawns. You can maybe even open up a scope diagonal, and black should win. Instead, we get queen f4, and now Magnus is able to play bishop e3, attacking both the queen and the bishop, or the queen and the knight, and suddenly it's getting very tricky. We have knight f3 played, takes, and now Magnus goes queen to f2. And even though black is better here, you'll notice that white's bishop now guards the pawn on h6. There's an open e file, and also even on the queen side, black cannot get a passed pawn here. White is covering both the c and the a file. So even though black has many more pawns, due to the opposite color b's, the dark square b on a great diagonal, also black's b on b5, simply doing nothing here. White has great chances to save the game. When you combine that with the low time situation as well, who knows? Maybe Magnus could even win the game. So we get queen to h3. We have queen h2 being played. We have takes, and now Alireza goes rook d6, trying to win the pawn on f6, and Magnus plays bishop g5 guarding. Now here, Alireza makes a very wise decision to sack the rook with rook takes pawn on f6. We get takes, king g3 takes. But after king to f4, even though black has, I believe, 3 pawns, a bishop and 3 pawns, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, versus white's 3 pawns, white is blockading all these pawns on the king side, and you still can't create a pass pawn on the queen side. And there are very serious chances for Magnus to create a swindle here, even though the computer still says black is much better. We get bishop d7 here. Magnus goes rook e7, and now we have a huge mistake with bishop to e6. Now, at this point, what Alireza should have played was bishop to c6, keeping the bishop on the diagonal, guarding the pawn. After king e5, rook h6, I guess rook f7 and rook h2. Black is better here. Is this winning, honestly? I'm not sure, because white can even run with the king to the queen side, but this would have been the best way to play. Instead, we get bishop e6, and now after rook to a1, suddenly Magnus Carlsen is threatening to infiltrate on the a file, and Alireza has completely messed this up, and he's going to have to be very, very careful not to lose the game. So we get the move king b5, Magnus goes check, we get king c6, and now we have the move rook b8. Here, Alireza goes rook g6, trying to push the pawns up the board, and we get this move rook a3. Now, Magnus spends 16 seconds throwing away the entire time advantage he had before playing this move. Rook to a4 would have been a better move, because after g3, which is probably the move he was worried about, there's rook to a7 here, and suddenly there's a very unusual mating pattern, which is if black goes g2, you can check and then mate with rook b6. King has no squares available here. Probably what Magnus thought was he probably saw rook g4, king e5, check, king f6, rook takes d4, and thought, wait, where's my checkmate? If I go check, the king is suddenly escaping to b4, and what am I even doing? But the computer actually says, after rook to c7, king b4, b6, black goes g2 here. Now you have rook g8, rook g4, and after takes b7, white is going to queen with check and win the game. Now, is this easy to find? No, it's not easy to find at all, but it's still worth pointing out in terms of one of the reasons that white should have taken the pawn on a4. So Magnus goes rook a3, stopping g3 here, and now Alireza goes king c7. We get rook to b5, rook to h6, and now Magnus plays rook takes a4. Here, Alireza goes rook to h3, and he's trying to bring this rook in to check the white king, but Magnus plays the best move in the position, rook to a7, and now Alireza is in serious trouble. Here, Alireza plays the move king c6, which is an epic fail. The best move is king to c8 here, and after rook to b6, even though the king is cut off, after bishop d7, with this passed g-pawn, white is probably quite a bit better here. Is it winning immediately? Definitely not, but black is in the game. Instead, Alireza goes king c6, and in this position, Magnus Carlsen misses a forced checkmate when he plays the move rook to c5. Now, one thing that I do want to point out about this is look at the time situation. Magnus is very low on time, and it's become abundantly clear to me that Magnus has this issue where when he gets very low on time, he simply is unable to do the pure calculations, and he starts playing on instinct, just playing moves, but the calculation method, or that switch, is simply turned off. Because if Magnus had even 20 seconds here, he would find rook a b7, followed by rook b6 mate, and it's actually a forced checkmate here. After rook f3, king g5, f6, and takes, there's simply no way to stop rook b6. It will be checkmate on the next turn, no matter what you do. It doesn't matter. Literally, any move you play, you get mated in one. So, instead, Magnus goes rook c5. Now we get king d6. It's still winning, by the way, because you can play rook b5 with the same idea of checkmate or rook a b7, but instead he goes check. Now Alireza goes king e7, and with his king running towards the king side here, now Alireza is completely fine, and if anybody is to be careful here, it is Magnus. So we get king g5. Now we have king to f8 being played. Magnus goes king f6. We get check, king e5, and now we have the move g3. Now after g3, this is apparently a mistake, but at this point, players with seconds on the clock, I don't think any of this is really all that unusual. Computer does say, by the way, king g7 here would be winning, because now after b5, there's rook to h2 hitting the pawn on b2. So instead we get g3, and now Magnus plays rook a1. Rook to a5 also would be good enough, but we get rook a1, which is played. Now we have rook to h4, and Magnus goes rook g1. Alireza plays f4, protecting the pawn on g3, and now we get the move b5. Here we have the move king e7 being played, which is a mistake, because after rook c7 and bishop d7, now Magnus can take the pawn on d5, and if he were to do this, he probably would save the game, because after rook g4, you can go king to e4, blockading these pawns once again, and now you have your passed b pawn, and black can never win. Instead, he goes b6 here, and now Alireza plays the move f6, another mistake. F3 would be the best move, but we get king d5, f3 is played, and here Magnus plays the move b7, and this move simply loses the game on the spot. What Magnus should have played was the move rook takes pawn, and the reason this would have been much better is that now if black goes f2, you can simply play rook to g7 check, and after king f8, you can take the bishop and line up the ladder checkmate, and if black were to play a move like, I don't know, rook h5 here, king c4, and f2, now you very calmly go rook to f3, and you'll take the pawn on f2, or push the b pawn up the board, and black will resign. Instead, Magnus plays the wrong sequence. He goes b7, And now Alireza plays move f2. We get the move rook takes g3. Rook to a1 apparently is still somehow a game after rook h8. And I guess rook f1, g2 takes queen, and you have rook e2. And I guess after this, somehow the game goes on with the king running to the queen side. Again, very dank and unrealistic, but white is alive. Instead, Magnus takes on g3, and now after Alireza spots the move rook to h5, the game is over, because when black queens his pawn after king e4 and f1, and Magnus checks, now black can hide the king on e6. You will not be able to queen with check, and here the game ends very quickly. We got queen, check, king f4, check, king g4, check, king h4, and after rook to h5, Magnus Carlsen gets checkmated, and the match is all tied at 1-1. Now, game 3 would be a relatively quick draw, so score is 1.5, 1.5, going into the fourth and final game where Magnus has the white pieces. So in this fourth game, Magnus with the white pieces starts with e4. We get c5, knight f3, and now Alireza plays e6 rather than d6. We got d3, knight c6, and now Magnus plays g3. Now what Magnus is aiming for, more sidelines, more kings in the attack style chess. We get d5, queen to e2, knight e7, and bishop g2. Alireza plays g6, we get h4, h6, and now Magnus plays the move e5. Here we get bishop g7, Magnus goes c3, and now we have the move b5, bishop to f4, and a5. Now what's going on here is Alireza is trying to push all the p on the queen side very, very quickly here to attack. Meanwhile, he doesn't really want to castle the king either, because white is trying to attack on the king side. Say you were to play a move like castles here, it already could be very dangerous after a move like queen to d2, because if you go knight f5, there's g4. And if you go king h7, maybe it doesn't work right away, but there might be something like h5, g5, and some kind of sack. Even here, if white goes g4 and g5, it feels very, very scary. So Alireza plays a5, Magnus plays knight d2, we get b4, a3, takes, and now we have the move a4. Magnus plays rook b1, we get bishop to a6, castles, and now Alireza goes knight f5. Now after knight to f5, Magnus plays rook fc1 here, trying to anticipate any sort of attack of the pawn on c3, and we get the move rook b8. Magnus now plays knight to f1, we get rook to b3, and we have the move knight e3 being played. All this relatively standard. I don't think it's worth going too deep into the ideas here, but Magnus is basically trying to argue that at some point something is going to happen either with c4 and on the diagonal, or something is going to happen over here on the king side, and the a3 pawn is not super relevant. We get rook takes pawn. Magnus trades the horse on f5, and now he goes rook to a1. We get takes, and it's looking like, even though temporarily black won that a3 pawn, you're going to lose this a4 pawn. Now your kingside structure is very compromised. It's very, very weak with these double pawns on f7 and f5, especially if you have to castle down the road. And Magnus is looking pretty good. So we get c4. Magnus plays queen c2 here. We get queen to b6. And now we have the move queen takes a4 being played. Alireza goes bishop b5. And now we get the move queen a3. And you're probably thinking, well, black should be better, right? Well, not so fast, because if you take the pawn on d3 here, now white can play rook b1, pinning this bishop on b5. You cannot castle your king, as that would castle through the check. And at this point, black is actually completely lost. If you go king d7 here, there's simply bishop f1, followed by bishop takes d3. And if you play a move like bishop f8, I can simply go queen b2. I'll win this bishop on b5 after knight a7 and knight to d4, and it's all but over. So Magnus has gotten himself into a situation where he is winning according to the computer, but in a human game, not so easy. We got bishop to f8, Magnus goes check, and now we get king d7. Here, Magnus takes on c4, we get takes, and we have the move knight d2. Now, at this point, Magnus should win the game because he's got the open a file for the rook and the queen. There's also pressure on the bishop on c4, and after bishop d3 and c4, it's spaghetti-o time. These diagonals are opening up, your king is in the line of fire, and it's looking like Magnus is on his way to a quick dub. So here, Alireza plays bishop g7 with 3 seconds on the clock. Now, keep in mind, at this point, Magnus has 42 seconds versus 3 seconds. He's got to win here, right? Surely he can win. So he goes queen to a4. Now, this move is not a bad move, but queen to a3 would have probably been better in this position. But I think Magnus probably thought after knight takes e5, cd5, that there maybe was something like a knight c4, maybe a knight g4. Probably he just panicked somewhat and he didn't play it. So he goes queen a4 instead, which is also quite good, make no mistake. But now after queen to d4, suddenly the queen is maybe attacking the rook. It targets the queen on a4, some pressure on the center of the board, but it's just a slight wrinkle. So Magnus goes rook d1, we get bishop to e2, and now Magnus plays rook b1, trying to go rook b7 to win the game. Here, Alireza plays rook c8, anticipating that if white goes rook b7 here, you simply block with the rook. Magnus goes for the move queen to a3, and this is a mistake. Now, the thing that you'll notice about this game is something I said quite recently. When I played Alireza in the Speed Chess Championship, the one thing I felt that he was very good at doing, he was just played like a god, is when he got low on time, he would defend the positions. Even if he was worse, he would still find good moves to keep the game going. And if we look at this position, we go back even a few moves. Magnus has 42 seconds versus 3 seconds. This is a position Magnus should win. He's winning on the board, winning on the clock. But because Alireza is able to play his moves and not crack the way that you sort of expect a player to crack when they get really low on time, Magnus ends up using way too much time here. And now all of a sudden, after Queen A3 and Bishop F8, Alireza has survived the worst. And he's actually not even much worse here, because now you'll notice versus the earlier positions, the rook is on C8. If this rook were on AH8, white would be winning. But with the rook on C8 after Queen A6 and Bishop C5, now black can block, black can go King E8, and you're threatening F2. And even though white is winning here, it's very, very spicy. Now in this position, Magnus decides to play the move pawn takes pawn, and this is just an epic fail. At this point, Bishop to E3 would win the game as you attack the queen, you attack the bishop, and most importantly, you stop the threats on the diagonal. And at this point, you would just win. But as I mentioned before, I'm getting the sense that Alireza's defense with limited time, it's really, really good. And I also would say that, you know, one thing that I've struggled with a lot as I get a little bit older is that when I get really low on time, when I get to like 5-6 seconds, even with 2-second increment, there are many cases where my brain just shuts off and I start playing on instinct. I can no longer do calculations. I just start playing whatever my mind tells me to play, basically. It's just like intuition, look, play a split-second move, but there's no calculation component anymore versus when I was a little bit younger. And I'm getting the sense that as I look at both game 2 and this 4th game as well, Magnus is also starting to struggle a little bit with that, where when he gets really, really low on time, the brain just shuts off and he just starts making moves and playing on instinct. And he decides to take the pawn on D5. We now get the move Queen F2, King H2. And here we inexplicably have this move pawn takes pawn. Now, what on earth is this from Alireza? You know, another thing that I've mentioned many times is there's a thing called the Magnus effect. Now, this is just GG. Legitimately, in this position, Alireza can snap the queen on A6 and it's game over. Magnus has done a bow test gambit, a proper one, which is not good, and he should lose the game. But somehow Alireza misses this. He plays move pawn takes pawn. And the only explanation I have for this is that the Magnus effect is simply too strong. You just don't expect Magnus to make these blunders. He is obviously the greatest player of all time, but you just don't expect this to happen. Now, if this were a bullet game, I have zero doubt in my mind that Alireza would spot this instantly, but somehow he just misses it. He takes the pawn instead of the free queen, and now Magnus, after queen b7, is suddenly winning the game once again, as Alireza is in check here. If you block with the rook, now there's e6, creating the classic fossil to win the rook. So Alireza goes king d8, and now after queen takes f7, white's king is actually very safe here. The rook covers the check on g1, and black's king, meanwhile, is getting checkmated very easily. So Alireza goes bishop e7, we get takes, king e8, and now Magnus checks. We get bishop f8. If you were to go king d7, there's e6 checkmate here. Queen guards the pawn. Dark squares are covered by the b, and it's GG. So we get bishop to f8. Magnus plays queen g6. Alireza goes king d8, and now we get the move queen f6, king to e8, and here the move rook b7 is played, creating the kebab on the 7th rank. White is simply going to be checkmating on one of these light squares around the black king, and that's all she wrote. Alireza plays knight e7, desperate to hang on. Magnus plays e6 here with the idea of queen f7. And here, Alireza, I believe, flags, or maybe resigned here. I think he flagged in this position. And Magnus Carlsen gets an unbelievable victory in this match by a score of 2.5 to 1.5. So, what is the takeaway from this game? There are a couple of takeaways. First one is that Alireza has some kind of nerve or some glitch when he plays against Magnus. Mind you, when I say that, I pretty much refer to every chess player on the planet. They have that glitch where the Magnus effect is a real thing and it affects them in a big way. Probably a better example of that would be the match between Magnus and Vishy Anand, where Vishy had a win and he missed the winning tactic. It's just one such example, but Alireza missing this free queen on a6 with a backwards diagonal is simply insane. I'm just going to be honest. It's insane. I think if this were a straight bullet game, he would have seen it, but somehow he goes blind and misses it, which means the Magnus effect still is a real thing. Now, the second big takeaway for me from this match is that Magnus, it felt like to me, was playing very much on the clock, trying to play a Nepo style, trying to put Alireza under pressure, see how good he is at defending, whether he's going to crack if he gets really low on time. And so that was sort of the test that I felt Magnus was posing to Alireza throughout this match. And then on the flip side, the other big thing we learned is that I think for Magnus, and I believe he said this actually before his SEC match against Alireza, is that when he gets really low on time, sometimes the brain just shuts off. I don't remember the exact wording that Magnus used, but something along those lines where the brain just shuts off and you stop calculating. And it seems very clear to me that from games 2 and 4, where he had a big time advantage on the clock, and especially in game 4, at some point when he gets low on time, he starts panicking a little bit. And that is something that, of course, I can relate to very well because it happens very frequently to me now in over-the-board blitz, and online bullet for sure. So I think for Magnus, that's one thing that he's got to be cognizant of, is if he's getting too low on time, that he is capable of just making howlers, these huge blunders that lose the game, and trying to avoid getting super low. Now, that being said, Alireza should have won this match, but he didn't win the match, which means that even though the younger generation is getting closer and closer to Magnus, he still is on top of the game. So Magnus wins this match by 2.5, 1.5. Now, what does that mean? That means that Magnus has won the winner's bracket of Division 1. Whoever comes out loser's bracket will have to beat Magnus in 2 matches, I believe, on Monday, if I'm not mistaken, in order to claim the crown. Now, Alireza did do this. He beat Magnus in 2 matches, I believe, 1 or 2 events ago in the Chess Champions Tour. So if it's Alireza, it could be very hype. At any rate, it's going to be either Alireza, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, or Levon Aroni. One of those 3 guys will emerge to face Magnus in the final, but they will have to beat him twice, and that's definitely going to be an uphill battle. So, on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the finals of the winner's bracket of Division 1 of the Julius Baer Generations Cup, part of the Chess Champions Tour, being held on chess.com. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with some more great recaps as we watch the Chess Champions Tour wrap up for this year. See you guys soon, and hope you enjoy it. Have a good one. Bye.